Content warning. This video contains disturbing content, descriptions of threatening behavior, and deeply unsettling true accounts. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you are under 18 years of age, or if you are sensitive to fear-inducing content, please do not watch. This content is intended for mature audiences only. The hole in the backyard. There's something about the house next door that you never fully understand. You wave in the morning. You wave in the evening. You share a fence, maybe a tree line, maybe the sound of their lawnmower on Sunday afternoons. You think you know them. You think proximity means something. And then, one day, completely out of nowhere, everything you assumed falls apart. And what's left behind is a question that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. My name is Ryan, and I've lived in the same house in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, for going on 11 years now. This is a neighborhood where people leave their garage, doors open, where kids ride bikes in the street past sundown, where the biggest concern on any given Tuesday is whether the HOA is going to send another letter about the length of your grass. It's the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad is supposed to happen. That's exactly why what I'm about to tell you broke me the way it did. About 5 years ago, my next-door neighbor, a man named Dale Hartwick, came to our front door looking like he hadn't slept in days. My wife, Karen, answered it first, and by the time I got to the door behind her, I could see his eyes were red and swollen. His hands were shaking. He told us his 17-year-old son, Mason, had gone missing. Mason, a kid I had watched shoot hoops in the driveway for years, a kid who used to wave at me from the backyard like it was the most natural thing in the world. Gone. Dale filed a missing persons report that same night. Within 48 hours, Mason's face was on the local news, then on flyers, then on social media. Our whole neighborhood put up signs. Karen and I left casseroles on Dale's front porch. We knocked and offered to help. We meant every word of it. We would have done anything. Weeks passed, then months, then a year, and then 2. No trace of Mason was ever found. No update from the police. No resolution. The investigation seemed to go cold in the same way that everything involving Mason went cold, quietly, without fanfare, without closure. We watched Dale and his wife, Patricia, change during those years. Patricia, who had always been warm and talkative at neighborhood block parties, became withdrawn. She stopped coming outside much. When she did, she moved fast, like she was trying to get from one place to another without being seen. Dale wasn't much different. He became jumpier, more nervous. His laugh, which used to be this big booming thing that you could hear 3 houses down, became rare. When he did laugh, it came out wrong, forced, like a sound he had to remind himself to make. We never brought up Mason directly. Karen and I talked about it privately many times, going back and forth on whether to say something. But what do you say? Every time I thought about opening my mouth, I'd think about how much worse I might make things. So we stayed quiet. We kept our distance and let them grieve in whatever way people grieve when there's no body to bury and no answer to cling to. That was the arrangement for almost 4 years. Until 3 weeks ago. I was dragging the garbage cans down to the curb on a Tuesday morning, just like any other Tuesday, when Dale came out of his side door and walked over to the fence line. He looked tired, the way he always looked tired now, but there was something else in his expression that morning, something I couldn't quite name. He asked if he could borrow a shovel. I said yes immediately, no hesitation. I went to the garage, grabbed my best one, a heavy-duty spade I'd had for years, and handed it over the fence. He thanked me without really making eye contact, said he had some yard work to take care of, said he'd get it back to me by the following day. He disappeared around the back of his house. Now, I wasn't trying to spy on him. That's the thing I want to make clear. It wasn't like I was hovering at the window, waiting for him to do something suspicious. It just happened. I was upstairs in the spare bedroom, the one with the window that faces his backyard, grabbing a jacket when I noticed Dale down below in the yard. He had marked off a section of the lawn near the back fence and was digging, and not lightly, not like he was planting a flower bed or putting in a small garden border. He was digging deep. The kind of effort that bends a man at the waist, the kind that makes you stop and catch your breath every few minutes. I watched for a moment and figured I'd go help. That's the neighborly thing to do. Guy's in his late 50s digging alone in the middle of the week. I grabbed my second shovel and walked around to his gate. I called his name. The moment he heard me, Dale dropped the shovel. Not set it down, dropped it. He came across the yard toward me at a pace that felt off, too fast, too deliberate. He reached me and said quietly but firmly, "Ryan, no, I've got it. Please, just go." I said, "Dale, it's really not a big deal. Let me help." He stepped closer. Close enough that I could see the sweat on his face, and I realized it wasn't just from the physical labor. He said, "I need you to leave my yard, Ryan." And then, without another word, he pointed at the gate. Like I was an animal he was shooing away. I left. I didn't argue. The whole interaction had this weight to it that made me feel like arguing would have been a mistake. Back upstairs, I watched from the window. He didn't look up at the house while he worked. He just dug. For another 45 minutes he dug that hole. When it finally looked like he was finished, when he stepped back and looked at it, he did something that I still think about every single day. He looked up. Not at the hole. Up. At the rooftops. At the neighboring houses. Scanning. Like he was checking to see if anyone had been watching. And then he looked directly at my window. I didn't have time to move. We locked eyes for a moment. I stepped away from the glass. But there's no version of that story where he didn't see me. None. I went downstairs and tried to shake it off. Told myself there was a logical explanation. People dig holes. People bury things in their backyard. Time capsules, old boxes, pet remains. It could have been anything. But I kept coming back to one thing. Why would a man digging a hole in his own yard care so much about whether his neighbor was watching? That night, around 1:30 in the morning, I heard it. The sound of a shovel hitting dirt. That rhythmic, hollow thud that you can't mistake for anything else once you've heard it enough. I got out of bed, slowly, careful not to wake Karen. I went to the window and looked, but it was too dark. Whatever was happening in Dale's yard, I couldn't see it from up here. So I did something I'm still not entirely sure was the right decision. I went outside. I pulled on shoes and a jacket and went out through the back, staying close to our fence line. From just over the top of the fence, I had a clear enough line of sight. Dale was down there in the dark, working by feel as much as by sight. The yard light from his neighbor's property on the other side cast just enough of a glow that I could make out his silhouette. At some point he went inside. I'm still not sure why. Maybe for water, maybe for a flashlight, maybe for something else entirely. But the moment his back door closed, I found myself at his gate. I told myself I was just going to look. I crossed the yard in a straight line to the hole. The moonlight wasn't much, but it was something. I crouched down and looked in. At the bottom of the hole, pushing through a thin layer of loose dirt, was the corner of a black garbage bag. I stared at it for what felt like a long time, long enough to feel my chest get tight, long enough to feel the cool night air hit the back of my neck in a way that made every hair stand up. I thought about reaching in. I thought about pulling it out. I didn't. Something in my gut told me to get back to my own yard, and I listened to it. I was over the fence and through my back door inside of 60 seconds. About 30 seconds after that, Dale's back door opened again. I watched from my kitchen window. He didn't go back to digging. He walked around to the far side of the yard and disappeared into the shadow beside the house. I don't know what he did over there. I waited for almost an hour, but he never came back into view. Eventually, I went back to bed, lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, not sleeping. The next morning, I looked out at Dale's yard first thing. The hole was filled in, completely, like it had never been there. His SUV, which he always kept in the driveway, was parked out on the street. The shovel, my shovel, was not returned. I didn't ask about it. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Dale hasn't spoken to me. He doesn't wave from the driveway. He doesn't make eye contact across the fence. If he sees me coming, he turns and goes inside. Karen asked me if something happened between us, and I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. But then, yesterday afternoon, middle of the day, full sunlight, nothing unusual about it at all, I happened to look across toward Dale's house from the living room window. He was standing at one of his upstairs windows, looking back at me. When he realized I could see him, he pulled the blinds closed. I haven't slept properly since. I keep thinking about Mason. I keep thinking about 4 years of nothing, no body, no answers, no resolution. I keep thinking about a man who reacted to the sight of his neighbor with something that looked a lot more like panic than surprise. I keep thinking about a black garbage bag at the bottom of a hole in a yard, and a car moved from the driveway to the street in the middle of the night, and a shovel that was never returned. I don't know what was in that bag. I don't know what happened to Mason Hartwick, but I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it means, it doesn't feel like nothing. 3 days after I saw Dale watching me from his window, Karen brought it up at dinner. She'd noticed the distance between us, the sudden silence where there used to be waves, the way he turned his back when she tried to call hello over the fence. She asked me again if something had happened. I told her we'd had a small disagreement. That was the word I used, disagreement, as if the man had returned a tool incorrectly or parked in front of our mailbox. I couldn't tell her the truth. I didn't even know how I would begin. Hey, so I think our neighbor might have buried something, or someone, in his backyard in the middle of the night, and now he's standing at windows watching us. It sounds insane when you say it out loud. It sounds like something a person says when they've started coming apart at the seams. But here's the thing about not sleeping, and I mean really not sleeping, the kind where you wake up at 3 a.m. with your pulse going and your mind already running. You start to notice details you missed the first time around. Like the fact that Dale's backyard, in all the years I've lived next to him, was always just grass. He never gardened, never planted anything. The first and only time I ever saw him with a shovel was the day he borrowed mine. Like the fact that Patricia, Dale's wife, left 3 days after that night. I watched her load 2 suitcases into her sedan early on a Saturday morning. Dale stood in the doorway but didn't help her. He didn't hug her. He just watched her back out of the driveway and drive away. She hasn't come back. Like the fact that the same week all of this happened, Dale started ordering groceries to be delivered instead of going to the store himself. None of these things are proof of anything. I know that, but when you pile them on top of each other, when you lay them all out side by side in your mind at 3 in the morning, they stop feeling like coincidences and start feeling like a pattern. I've thought about calling the police 100 times. I've picked up my phone. I've even typed out the non-emergency number. But every time I get close to pressing call, I stop. Because what do I tell them? I think my neighbor dug a hole and buried something? Every homeowner in America has buried something in their backyard at some point. A dead dog, old junk, leftover concrete. What makes what I saw different? Nothing. Nothing except the way Dale acted. Nothing except the look on his face when he told me to leave. Nothing except the way he scanned the rooftops like a man who was used to being careful. And then there's the other thing. The thing I haven't let myself think about directly until now. Mason disappeared 5 years ago. He was 17. He was never found. And the case has been effectively cold for 3 of those 5 years. If you know anything about missing persons cases, especially the ones involving teenagers, you know that the longer they go unsolved, the more likely it is that someone close to the victim was involved. Law enforcement knows this. The statistics are grim and consistent. Most missing children are taken by someone who knew them. What if Mason never left? What if he's been in that backyard the whole time? What if something happened? An accident, an argument, something that went wrong, and Dale panicked and made a decision that he's been living inside of ever since? And what if, after 5 years, something shifted? Some fear, some development, some pressure that I don't know about? And he decided to move whatever he buried? I don't want to believe it. I genuinely, deeply do not want to believe it. This is a man who cried at our kitchen table. This is a man who handed out flyers with his son's face on them. This is a man whose whole life appeared to collapse the day his son vanished. But sometimes the people who appear most broken by loss are the ones carrying the weight of what really happened. I don't know what to do. I genuinely don't know. The police feel like a reach. Saying nothing feels like a betrayal of something I can't quite name. Going back into that yard, which, let's be clear, I am not doing again, was already more than I should have done. So, for now, I watch. I keep the window shade cracked just slightly at night. I keep my phone charged. I keep the back door locked. And I wait. Because whatever Dale did or didn't do that night, one thing is certain. He knows that I saw something, and that means I'm no longer just a neighbor to him. I'm a witness. The boy's next. Door. Some of the most frightening things that ever happened to me didn't happen in the dark. They happened in broad daylight, right in the middle of a quiet American neighborhood, while other people were going about their completely ordinary lives just a few houses down. I'm going to tell you about the summer I was 16 years old. I'm going to tell you about the 2 brothers who lived next door to us, and I'm going to tell you why, even now, 20 years later, I still lock my windows every single night before I go to sleep. My family moved a lot when I was a kid. Not military-style moving, not packing up every year, just more than most families do. The house I'm talking about was our second home, a 2-story colonial on a dead-end street in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. We'd moved there when I was about 11, and by the time the events I'm about to describe took place, we'd been there just over 4 years. Our neighbors to the right were the Morrow family. 2 boys, Caleb and Derek, and their father, a man named Gerald, who, in 4 years of living next door, I had spoken to maybe 3 or 4 times total. He wasn't unfriendly exactly. He was just absent. Whether he worked long hours or had something else going on, I don't know. What I know is that Caleb and Derek were largely on their own. They were strange kids. I knew their names because we'd had maybe 2 or 3 brief exchanges over the years, the way you do with neighbors when there's no particular reason to get closer. My little brother, Danny, who was 11 at the time and 5 years younger than me, had his own impression of them. He thought they were weird, and he was right. Caleb was probably close to my age. Derek was younger, maybe 13 or 14. They dressed in camouflage more often than not. Not like a fashion thing, like a function thing, the kind of head-to-toe gear that hunters wore. In the backyard, they'd spend hours doing things I couldn't quite make out from our window. They seemed self-contained in a way that was unusual for teenagers. No friends over, no loud music, no chaos, just the two of them, constantly busy with something. The first time they really spoke to me was a Saturday morning in late July. Danny and I were in the driveway shooting hoops. Not a serious game, just killing time, when Caleb walked over from next door and asked, through the chain-link fence, if it was true that we were moving. I said, yeah, that our family was leaving at the end of August. He nodded like this was information he'd been waiting for. We talked for a few minutes, the casual back and forth of two teenagers who didn't know each other well. He was quieter than I expected, more deliberate in the way he spoke. At the end of the conversation, he asked if I wanted to come with him and Derek the next day to shoot BB guns along the creek that ran through the woods at the edge of our development. I said sure. It was a weekend. I didn't have plans. Danny asked if he could come, and Caleb said yeah without any real enthusiasm, and then went back to his yard. That should have been the end of it, a forgettable afternoon with two kids I'd barely spoken to before we all went our separate ways. But it wasn't. The next day, just as the sun was starting to drop toward late afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Caleb and Derek were standing on the porch, and the first thing I noticed was the duffel bag. It was large, military green, worn along the handles, the kind that holds a lot. The second thing I noticed was that they were both in full camouflage, pants, jackets, boots, like they'd been preparing for this for a while. Our parents were home, which meant we had to be careful. They knew we were going outside, but they didn't know with who or exactly where. We made our exit as fast and naturally as we could. Walking down the sidewalk with these two felt immediately strange. Danny kept catching my eye. That look. Brothers exchange when they're both thinking the same thing and trying not to laugh. The Morrows walked with this serious, focused energy. No small talk. No joking around. They moved like they had a mission. We reached the tree line at the edge of the neighborhood and followed a path through the brush down to the creek. The sound of water. Dappled late afternoon light through the leaves. It would have been peaceful under other circumstances. Derek dropped the duffel bag, unzipped it, and the first thing that came out was not a BB gun. It was a handgun. I remember the specific moment I understood what I was looking at. There's that half-second where your brain refuses to process the information correctly, and then it does, and everything shifts. I felt it in my stomach first, then in my chest. Caleb reached into the bag and produced a second one. He handed it toward me and Danny, like it was nothing. I grabbed Danny's arm before he could take it. I said, "What is this?" Caleb looked at me without any particular expression. He said they were real. He said it the way you'd say the sky is blue, completely matter of fact. I put myself between the guns and Danny and started backing up toward the trail. I said we weren't doing this. I said we were leaving. Derek had already loaded one of the guns and had begun firing into the trees across the creek. The sound was sharp and flat at the same time, not as loud as movies make it seem, but real enough that my body responded before my brain did. I felt my legs go rigid. I said we were leaving again, louder this time. Both brothers looked at me. What I saw on their faces was not anger exactly. It was something slower and colder than anger, like disappointment, like I'd failed some kind of test. One of them, I think it was Derek, said something at us as we turned and walked away. It was a curse word, shouted in that flat, cold tone. We didn't look back. Danny was quiet the whole walk home. Not scared quiet, more like processing quiet, the way kids get when they understand that something real just happened and they're not sure what to do with it. At dinner that night, I told our parents that the Morrow boys were weird, that we'd gone out with them and it hadn't gone well. I didn't say why. I don't entirely know why I didn't. Some combination of not wanting to get in trouble for being there in the first place and something else. Some instinct that telling the whole story might make things worse rather than better. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up with cold air on my face. It took me a moment to understand that my window was open, not cracked, fully open. And then I felt it. Something hard, pressed against the back of my head. I didn't scream. I don't know how. Every instinct in my body wanted to, but instead I just went completely still. I heard Caleb's voice behind me, low and close, almost whispering. He told me that if I told anyone, about what had happened at the creek, he would come back. He said he'd hurt me. He said he'd hurt my whole family. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't ranting. He said it the way someone recites a list of facts. I said, okay. He pushed my head forward once with the barrel of the gun before pulling it away. I heard him go back through the window. I sat on the edge of my bed for probably 45 minutes before I could make myself move. Here's what the next few weeks looked like. Every night, I checked my window twice before I got into bed. I pushed my desk chair under the doorknob. I told Danny to do the same and explained just enough that he'd understand why without explaining everything. And every night, without fail, I'd catch one of them at the window of their house, the window that faced into my room or Danny's, just watching. Sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for longer than that. They never waved. They never did anything. They just watched. 3 days before we moved, a rock hit my window at around midnight. I went to the glass slowly and looked out. Caleb was standing in the yard below, holding a gun, aimed up. I hit the floor. From the ground, I heard both of them laughing. One of them said something that I'm not going to repeat. I stayed on the floor until the sound of their footsteps faded back toward their house. That was the last direct encounter. The night before we moved, our family loaded boxes into a rental truck until almost midnight. I watched both brothers stand at the edge of their property line and watch us the entire time. Gerald, their father, never came outside. I didn't look at them. Danny didn't look at them. We just moved boxes and pretended they weren't there. We pulled out of that neighborhood the next morning, and I watched the Morrow house through the rear window until I couldn't see it anymore. Danny and I have never fully talked about it, not as adults, not in any real, direct way. We've referenced it obliquely. Remember those kids next door? But neither of us has ever sat down and gone through the whole thing, start to finish. I think we both understand, without saying it, that some experiences don't need to be re-examined. They just need to be survived, filed away, and left alone. But I do lock my windows, every night, without exception, and when I see a duffel bag dropped onto the ground and unzipped, my pulse still picks up for just a second before I remind myself where I am. The woman in the room. I want to preface this by saying that I don't scare easily. I've lived alone since I was 22. I've lived in bad neighborhoods. I've had crappy apartments and crappy neighbors and crappy landlords, and I've dealt with all of it without losing sleep. I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or convinces themselves that every strange noise is something sinister. What happened to me 2 weeks ago genuinely shook me, and I still don't fully know how to process it. I graduated college last spring. No job lined up. Limited savings, the kind of entry-level income that requires you to make geographic compromises. The neighborhood I ended up in, a lower-income pocket of a mid-sized city in the Midwest, was the only place I could afford to rent a small house on my own. I knew what I was getting into: loud neighbors, older homes, people whose lives looked different from the ones I grew up around. I was okay with that. What I was not fully prepared for was the house immediately to my left. 2 women lived there. The older one, I'd guess she was in her mid-60s. I'll call Margaret. She had gray hair, a stone-faced expression that never changed, and an energy that made it clear she did not want to be spoken to under any circumstances. The few times I tried to wave, she either didn't see me or pretended not to. Once I said good morning from across the driveway. She looked at me, looked away, and went inside. The second woman was younger, late 30s, maybe early 40s. I never learned her name. She had some form of severe developmental or behavioral disability. I can't say exactly what, because I'm not qualified to. What I can tell you is what I observed. She had episodes, intense ones. She'd rock back and forth rapidly with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She'd scream. She'd make sounds that didn't resolve into words. During these episodes, Margaret would hold her, physically restrain her sometimes, and try to calm her down. It was unsettling. I won't pretend otherwise. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying it because watching someone in genuine distress, someone who doesn't have control over their own reactions, is a hard thing to witness, especially when you're right next door and you can't do anything and you don't fully understand what you're seeing. The first few weeks, I gave them space. I stayed inside when things got loud. I tried to make peace with it as part of the texture of living where I was living. That changed on a Thursday night in October. I had an early shift the next morning, 7 a.m., which meant I needed to be up by 5:30 at the latest. I went to bed at 10. By 11, the noise next door had gotten bad enough that I couldn't sleep. The younger woman was in a bad episode. I could hear her screaming through the wall. I could hear Margaret yelling back, not at me, just trying to manage the situation, but still loud enough to fill my bedroom. By midnight, I'd had enough. I want to be clear, I was not aggressive, I was not unkind. I walked over to their door and knocked as politely as I could and asked, calmly, if they could please try to keep the noise down. Margaret opened the door. Her first words were, "What the hell do you want?" I explained. I kept my voice level. I explained about my early shift and that I just needed to sleep. She raised her eyebrows, tilted her chin down, the look of someone who found the very existence of my request offensive. And then, from inside the house, the younger woman appeared in the doorway behind her, screaming, "Not at Margaret, at me! How dare you! How dare you!" Over and over, getting louder each time. Margaret had to physically turn and hold her back, and then she slammed the door in my face. I stood on their porch for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I walked home. The strange thing was, it worked. Once I was back in bed, the noise next door faded and eventually stopped. Either Margaret got her calm, or the younger woman tired herself out. Whatever the reason, I fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I was out before I woke up. The clock said 3:14 a.m. I lay there in the dark, trying to identify what had woken me up. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. After a minute or two, I decided it was nothing, some fragment of a dream or a car outside, and I closed my eyes again. I woke up a second time at 3:34. I lay completely still and listened. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the faint sound of the street, outside. I couldn't hear anything else. And then I heard something else. It came from the corner of the room closest to the window. A sound that I can only describe as a shuffle, the sound of something adjusting its weight, the sound of someone trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding. I didn't move. My eyes were already open, adjusting to the dark. The room was not pitch black. There was ambient light from the street through the curtains, enough to see the basic shapes of furniture. I looked at every corner of the room, my desk, my dresser, the closet door, which I always left open, the chair by the window. Nothing. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, trying to move slowly. I found it and held it face down against my chest, keeping the screen from lighting up. I lay still for another full minute, listening. The shuffle again, closer. I turned slowly in the direction it had come from, the side of the bed facing the wall, and I looked down toward the floor. There was a shape there, dark, low, at the edge of my bed frame. It was the wrong shape for anything that should be in my room. I turned my phone screen on. The light hit the face of the younger woman from next door. She was crouched at the side of my bed, her face inches from the mattress, looking up at me. When the light hit her, she screamed, a sound completely unlike anything I can describe, and lunged backward. I screamed. I rolled out of bed, hit the floor, scrambled for the door. Behind me, she was still screaming. I could hear her moving in the dark. I got through the bedroom door and pulled it shut behind me. I ran down the stairs. I locked the stairwell door. I backed up against the far kitchen wall with my phone in my hand and called 911. From the other side of the door, I could hear her pounding, screaming words I couldn't make out, the sound of fists against wood. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me. I told them my address, I told them what was happening, I told them to please hurry. The officers arrived within 6 minutes, though it felt like much longer. They entered through the front. They went upstairs. By the time they came back down, they had her with them. Calmer now, or exhausted, I don't know. She wasn't screaming anymore. Margaret arrived within minutes after that, as if she'd been waiting for the call. She spoke to the officers at length. She pleaded with them not to take her in. She said she was harmless, that she had a condition, that this wasn't what it looked like. The officers were professional but firm. They told Margaret that regardless of the circumstances, the woman had broken into a neighbor's home. They had an obligation to take her in for the night. One officer turned to me and asked if I wanted to press charges. In that moment, Margaret looked at me. I've been looked at with a lot of different expressions in my life: anger, frustration, disappointment. This was different. This was hate, plain and clear, without a single attempt at concealment. If she had been close enough to whisper something in my ear, I don't think I would have wanted to hear it. I said no. I didn't want to press charges. The officers took the younger woman out to their vehicle. Margaret stood in my doorway a moment longer than necessary before she left. 5 minutes later, I watched through the window as she got into her car and drove away into the dark. It was almost 4:30 in the morning. I sat at my kitchen table with all the lights on until sunrise. I didn't go back to sleep. Here's where things stand now. They still live next door. Both of them. They came back the following day as if nothing had happened. The younger woman stood in the front yard and stared at my house for a solid 10 minutes without moving. When I stepped out onto the porch, she didn't react. She just kept staring. Margaret, to my knowledge, has not looked at me once since that night, which almost feels worse than if she had. The absence of acknowledgement is its own kind of message. I've started looking at apartments. The commute would be longer, the rent would be higher, but I'd sleep without a chair propped under my doorknob, and right now that feels worth more than I would have believed possible 3 weeks ago. There's something about the house next door that you never fully understand. I started with that idea, and I want to end with it because I think it's the truest thing I can say. These people are our closest strangers. We share walls and fences and driveways and mornings. We wave, we nod. We exist in each other's peripheral vision for years at a time. And then, sometimes, one day, without any warning, the thing you never saw coming comes out from the space between what you knew and what was actually true, and you're left trying to figure out what to do with what you saw.